You know that feeling when you're driving through your city and something just feels wrong? Not dangerous, not chaotic, just spiritually exhausting. Row after row of identical glass boxes, strip malls that could be anywhere, housing developments with all the charm of a storage facility. And you think to yourself, am I crazy or is this genuinely ugly? Here's what Roger Scruton would tell you. You're not crazy. You're perceiving something real. Modern cities are ugly, objectively, measurably, harmfully ugly. And there's a reason architects don't want you thinking too hard about why. The reason isn't some grand conspiracy. It's something more insidious, a fundamental error in how modern architecture understands its own purpose. An error so deeply embedded in architectural education that most architects genuinely don't see it. An error that's been destroying the beauty of our cities for nearly a century. And the cost? It's not just aesthetic. Scruton demonstrates that living in ugly environments damages human flourishing in ways we're only beginning to understand. The poor suffer most, trapped in brutalist housing projects that will horrify anyone forced to live there. Meanwhile, the architects who designed them win awards and give TED Talks about honesty in materials. What's the error? What truth are we missing? And why does it matter so desperately for how you'll live the rest of your life? If you ever walked through a historic neighborhood and felt your soul exhale, then been plunged back into concrete and glass and felt it contract, you've experienced what Scruton spent his life explaining. You're not being nostalgic. You're not being elitist. You're perceiving the presence or absence of something objectively necessary for human life. Beauty as moral truth. In this exploration, you'll discover why modern cities wound us, what architectural principle we've catastrophically abandoned, and how Scruton offers not just critique, but a path back to building places worthy of human habitation. If you want to discover more about beauty, tradition, and human flourishing through the thinking of Roger Scruton and other profound thinkers, subscribe to this channel where we explore ideas that actually matter for how you live. Let's start with your experience. Because Scruton always insisted philosophy must begin with what we actually feel and perceive. Picture this. You're visiting a new city for work. You land, rent a car, drive toward downtown. What you see? Mile after mile of commercial sprawl. Buildings that could house a bank, a dental office, or a tech startup, and you genuinely can't tell which without reading the sign. Parking lots, more glass boxes, a freeway overpass, chain restaurants with corporate architecture guidelines, ensuring the Applebee's in Phoenix looks identical to the one in Pittsburgh. Something in you dies a little, doesn't it? Now contrast that with a different experience. You're walking through Charleston's historic district, or Bath in England, or Quebec City's Old Town. The buildings aren't necessarily grander. Many are modest townhouses. But something happens to your nervous system. You slow down. You look up. You notice details. A wrought iron balcony, a carefully proportioned window, the way one building's roof-line conversation with its neighbor. You feel, perhaps for the first time in weeks, like you can breathe fully. Scruton would say, trust that reaction. It's not subjective preference. It's your soul recognizing the presence or absence of something it needs. But we've been trained to distrust that reaction, haven't we? We've been told that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that preferring traditional architecture is nostalgia at best, elitism at worst, that modern architecture is honest and functional, while traditional design is fake and decorative. Here's what fascinates me most. Scruton doesn't just say, no, beauty is objective. He shows you why the modern position is philosophically incoherent. He demonstrates that the very people telling you beauty is subjective are making objective aesthetic judgments constantly. They just don't notice. Watch how this works. A modernist architect will tell you, we don't need ornament. Form follows function. A building should honestly express its purpose and materials. Okay, but honestly expressing something is itself an aesthetic value. Calling a building honest versus dishonest is making a moral aesthetic judgment. The modernist hasn't eliminated aesthetic values. He's just chosen different ones, often uglier ones. And notice what happened to our cities when architects decided beauty didn't matter, only function. We got buildings that don't actually function better. They leak, they're uncomfortable, they age terribly, but they certainly abandon beauty. We got the worst of both worlds. Scruton observed something crucial. When architects said form follows function, they were lying. What they meant was form follows my aesthetic ideology about what buildings should look like to signal I'm modern and progressive. Think about brutalist public housing. Those massive concrete towers that went up across Britain and America in the 1960s. Were they functional? Ask the people who had to live in them. Crime-ridden, impossible to maintain. Psychologically oppressive. The elevators broke. The concrete stained. Within 20 years, cities were demolishing them as uninhabitable. But here's the thing, they won architecture awards when they were built. The architects genuinely believed they were creating workers' paradise. They thought traditional housing with pitched roofs and human-scaled streets was oppressive. They were going to liberate the working class with radical new forms. Scruton would say, the error started before the first foundation was poured. It started when architects convinced themselves that beauty was optional, that architectural tradition was constrained to escape rather than wisdom to inherit. You know what's devastating? The working class never asked for concrete towers. They wanted what everyone wants. Pleasant places to live, with gardens and light and rooms that feel like home. But the architects knew better. And the working class got to live in the architect's ideology, while the architects themselves lived in converted Victorian townhouses. Notice how this reveals something about modern architecture's fundamental dishonesty. It claims to serve function, to be democratic, to reject elitism, but it consistently produces buildings the architects themselves wouldn't want to inhabit, in the name of principles the actual residents never requested. So what exactly went wrong? Where's the error that cascaded into city-destroying consequences? Scruton identified it with precision. Modern architecture embraced a fundamentally false principle. Form follows function, and built an entire ideology around it. Let me show you why that principle, which sounds so reasonable, is actually nonsense. First, consider, what's the function of a house? To provide shelter, you might say, okay, but a concrete bunker provides shelter. So does a shipping container. So does a cave. Are we done? Is any form that provides shelter equally good? Obviously not, because shelter isn't the only function. A house must also be a home. It must accommodate family life, privacy, hospitality, rest, work, child rearing, aging, dying. It must situate you in a neighborhood, a tradition, a place. It must age gracefully over decades. It must contribute to the street's beauty, or at least not destroy it. Wait, notice what happened? Once we honestly listed a building's actual functions, beauty appeared as one of them, not decoration applied afterward, not optional luxury. Beauty is itself a function, arguably the most important one. Scruton hammered this point relentlessly. A building that shelters you while making your soul sick is failing at its primary function. We are not merely biological organisms needing weather protection. We are spiritual beings needing environments that acknowledge our nature. But here's where the modernist error gets truly interesting. The architects who most loudly proclaimed form follows function consistently designed buildings that fail functionally. They leaked. They couldn't be heated efficiently. They were impossible to maintain. The flat roofs they loved, because pitched roofs were dishonest, pretending to be shelters when we have central heating now. Those flat roofs pooled water and rotted. It's almost funny if it weren't so tragic. Traditional architecture, which modernists mocked as non-functional decoration, actually worked beautifully. Those pitched roofs shed water. Those cornices directed rainwater away from walls. Those human-scale windows provided optimal light. Those ornamental elements often served structural purposes. Traditional builders, who'd never heard of form follows function, somehow created buildings that functioned superbly for centuries, while modernists, obsessed with function, created buildings that had to be demolished within decades. What explains this paradox? Scruton's answer: traditional builders understood something modernists forgot. They knew that a building's deepest function is to be a home for the human spirit. And the human spirit has requirements that can't be reduced to shelter, efficiency, or honest expression of materials. Let me make this concrete with Scruton's favorite example: Venice. Walk through Venice and look at the buildings along the Grand Canal. You'll see some genuine masterpieces: Palladio's churches, the Doge's palace, Santa Maria della Salute. Architectural genius, right? But notice what's extraordinary. The buildings around them. The ordinary merchant houses. The modest apartments. The everyday structures that most visitors barely notice. What do? They fit in. They step back. They use similar proportions, compatible materials, harmonious colors. They don't compete with the masterpieces. They frame them, support them, create the context that makes the great buildings great. None of those modest buildings is trying to be the most innovative, most attention-grabbing, most honest structure on the block. They're content to be beautiful supporting players in an ensemble. Now contrast that with modern city. Every single building is screaming for attention. This one's all glass. This one's twisted. This one's covered in titanium. This one looks like it's melting. Each architect desperate to create an individual masterpiece that will photograph well and win awards. The result? Chaos, visual cacophony, a streetscape where your eye doesn't know where to rest, where nothing relates to anything else, where the overall effect is aggressively ugly despite, or because of, each building's attempt to be striking. Scruton observed, traditional architecture understood that most buildings should be good neighbors, not soloists. The principle wasn't form follows function. It was form respects context. Buildings should fit into the human community of structures around them. This is the error architects don't want you thinking about, that their obsession with individual innovation, with each building being a revolutionary statement, produces cities fundamentally hostile to human flourishing. But why? Why would intelligent, educated people embrace principles that produce such terrible results? Because, and here's where Scruton's analysis becomes truly fascinating, modern architecture isn't really about buildings. It's about ideology. Let me show you what I mean. In the early 20th century, a generation of architects had a revelation. They looked at industrial buildings, factories, warehouses, grain silos, and thought, these are beautiful. They're honest. They don't hide their function with ornament. Architects like Le Corbusier started saying, a house is a machine for living in, not a home, a machine. Notice the shift? We're no longer trying to create dwellings for human souls. We're designing optimal machines for biological processes. This sounds almost reasonable until you think about it for 10 seconds. When's the last time you felt affection for a machine? When did a machine give you a sense of belonging, continuity with the past, hope for the future? When did a machine make you feel at home? But the appeal wasn't really about efficiency. Scruton identified what was actually happening. Architects were embracing an ideology about what the modern world should be. They were trying to create a revolutionary new human being through revolutionary new architecture. The old human being, the one who loved ornament and tradition and pitched roofs, he was backwards, wasn't he? Trapped in history, weighed down by inherited forms. The new human being, liberated by technology, would live in pure, rational, undecorated spaces and become pure, rational, undecorated himself. You see the problem? They were trying to use architecture to engineer a new kind of person. And when the actual human beings kept preferring traditional buildings, kept feeling depressed in concrete towers, kept wanting homes instead of machines, well, clearly the people needed more education, more exposure to pure forms. Eventually they'd evolve. Scruton would say, with that dry British wit, it never occurred to them that perhaps human nature wasn't the problem. Here's what's chilling. This ideology explicitly rejected beauty as a goal, not because beauty was impossible to achieve functionally. We know traditional architecture achieved both, but because beauty was suspect. Beauty was associated with the past, with tradition, with hierarchy, with Western civilization. All the things progressive architects wanted to destroy. Le Corbusier literally said we should demolish central Paris and replace it with his tower in the park housing blocks. Imagine that. Demolish the Marais, the Latin Quarter, the boulevards, all that accumulated beauty, and replace it with the projects. Thank God the French ignored him. But in Britain and America, we actually did it. We let ideological architects demolish beautiful working-class neighborhoods, places people love, communities that function, and replace them with brutalist nightmares that had to be torn down within a generation. If this examination of how ideology destroyed beauty resonates with you, hit like so more people can discover why we must reclaim architecture from failed experiments. Scruton documented this with devastating clarity. The modernist architect doesn't ask, what do people actually want and need? He asks, what should people want if my ideology is correct? And then he builds for the imaginary people, not the real ones. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but surely we can't just go back to building like it's 1850. We have new technologies, new needs, different economic realities. And Scruton would completely agree. He wasn't advocating literal copying of old styles. He was advocating learning from architectural tradition, understanding why traditional buildings worked, what human needs they satisfied, what wisdom they embodied. There's a difference between dead tradition, empty repetition of forms we don't understand, and living tradition, inheriting and adapting wisdom to new circumstances. What drives me crazy is how modernist architects position themselves as the brave innovators while traditional architects were supposedly timid copiers. But who's really copying whom? Every modernist building looks like every other modernist building. Glass box, glass box, glass box. Occasionally a twisted glass box for variety. Meanwhile, traditional architecture was infinitely varied. Compare English Georgian to Italian Renaissance to American colonial. All traditional, all beautiful, all completely different because they responded to place, climate, materials, culture. The supposed innovators produced monotony. The supposed copiers produced endless variety. What does that tell you about who actually understood architecture? Let's talk about what this error actually costs. Not in abstract aesthetic terms, but in human flourishing. Scruton made a claim that sounded extreme at first. Beauty is a human need, not a luxury. Depriving people of beauty is harming them. Is that really true? Or is it elitist nonsense? Poor people need housing and jobs, not architectural ornamentation. Here's what fascinates me about Scruton's response. He'd say, that framing already accepts a modernist error. It assumes beauty is decoration, something added to function. But beauty is functional. It serves needs that are just as real as shelter and employment. Think about it this way. Why does virtually every human culture, including the poorest, invest enormous effort in making things beautiful? Traditional rural villages in Africa, Asia, South America, desperately poor by modern standards, nonetheless have beautiful textiles, beautiful pottery, beautiful architecture. Not because they're wasteful, but because humans need beauty to fully live. Now look at modern public housing, built by wealthy governments with massive budgets, using advanced technology, and they're soul-crushingly ugly. Why? Because the architects decided beauty was optional. They decided poor people just need efficient shelter. Scruton would observe, the medieval peasant in his cottage, surrounded by beautiful churches and public buildings, had something the modern public housing resident utterly lacks, an environment that acknowledged a spiritual dignity. This isn't romanticizing poverty. Medieval life was brutally hard, but the cultural assumption was that everyone, regardless of wealth, deserved beauty in their surroundings. The parish church was beautiful. The village square was beautiful. Beauty was democratically distributed. Modern architecture inverted this. Beauty became something only the rich could afford, in their custom homes by expensive architects who suddenly remembered how to design beautifully when the client was wealthy. The poor got rational efficiency, which is to say, ugliness. You know what's devastating? Studies now confirm what Scruton argued philosophically. People living in ugly environments have higher rates of depression, anxiety, and asocial behavior. Crime rates are higher in brutalist housing projects than in traditional neighborhoods of equivalent poverty. Children's development is affected by environmental aesthetics. This isn't subtle. It's measurable. Ugliness harms human beings. And it's not just about explicit ugliness. It's about what modern architecture eliminates: the sense of home, of belonging, of being situated in history and place. Think about a traditional neighborhood. Buildings that have stood for generations. Architectural details that connect you to the people who built them. Materials that age gracefully, developing patina and character. Streets scale for walking, for encountering neighbors, for children to play. Now, think about a modern development. Buildings designed to be demolished in 30 years. No connection to local tradition or climate. Materials that don't age, they just deteriorate. Streets scale for cars, not humans. Architecture that could be anywhere that tells you nothing about place or history or community. One environment tells you, you belong here. You're part of a story that began before you and will continue after you. You're home. The other environment tells you, you're a temporary economic unit passing through an interchangeable space. Nothing here matters beyond its current function. Scruton insisted this was about rich versus poor, urban versus rural. It was about whether we design environments that acknowledge human beings have souls. Here's where I find his argument most powerful. He'd ask, why does it hurt you to see a beautiful building demolished? Notice that question. Why should you care? It's not your property. You derive no economic benefit from its existence. If beauty is truly subjective, its destruction should be emotionally neutral. One person's preference replacing another's. But it's not neutral, is it? When you see a beautiful 19th century building demolished for a parking garage, something in you grieves. When you watch a historic neighborhood bulldoze for a highway, you feel genuine loss. Scruton would say, your pain reveals you're perceiving something objective. You recognize the loss of something valuable. Not valuable to you personally, but valuable in itself. Beauty is not in your eye, it's in the building, and its destruction is an objective loss. This is why the architectural error matters so desperately. It's not just about aesthetics. It's about whether we acknowledge that beauty, tradition, and human-scaled environments are moral necessities, not optional luxuries. So what do? Can we actually recover from a century of architectural devastation? Scruton's answer might surprise you. He wasn't pessimistic. He believed recovery was possible, but only if we're honest about what went wrong and willing to learn from what worked. First, we need to abandon the lie that you can't go back. Watch how that phrase functions. It's not an argument. It's a conversation stopper. It assumes that time moves in only one direction intellectually, that whatever comes later must be better. But that's obviously false. Medicine went back to hand washing after a period of thinking it unnecessary. We can recover lost wisdom. The question isn't whether we can go back, but whether the past knew something valuable we've forgotten. And traditional architecture demonstrably knew something we've forgotten: how to build beautiful, functional, durable, human-scaled environments that people actually wanted to live in. Scruton observed that traditional architecture wasn't one thing. It was accumulated wisdom from thousands of local building traditions, each adapted to specific places, climates, materials, and cultures. What they shared wasn't style, but principles. Respect for human scale, use of local materials, ornament that serves structure, buildings that fit into communities. Here's what gives me hope. When people are actually given choices, they consistently choose traditional architecture. Study after study shows people prefer traditional neighborhoods to modernist ones. They'll pay premiums to live in walkable historic districts. They vacation in beautiful old cities, not brutalist new ones. The market is screaming a message architects refuse to hear. Build us beautiful places. And increasingly, architects are listening. There's a movement, new urbanism, traditional architecture, classical architecture, of architects who rejected modernist ideology and returned to learning from tradition, not copying superficially, understanding deeply. Why did traditional buildings use certain proportions? How did they handle transitions between public and private space? What made traditional streets work for community formation? And then adapting that wisdom to contemporary needs, using modern materials and technologies, but in service of timeless principles rather than revolutionary ideology. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. Poundbury, a development in England designed on traditional principles, uses contemporary construction techniques, but traditional forms, materials, proportions. Mixed use, walkable, human-scaled. Modernist architects mocked it as fake, nostalgic, Disney-fied. But you know what happened? People desperately wanted to live there. Demand vastly exceeded supply. It became one of the most desirable places to live in England. Why? Because it turns out humans still need what humans have always needed: beauty, community, human scale, connection to place. Scruton would say, Poundbury isn't revolutionary. It's just remembering what we knew for thousands of years and briefly forgot. Or consider Charleston, South Carolina. Strictly enforces traditional architectural standards in its historic district. Modernist architects call it oppressive, anti-innovative. But Charleston is thriving. People move there specifically for its beauty. Its economy booms precisely because it refused to embrace architectural progress. Meanwhile, cities that embraced every modernist innovation, that demolished their historic buildings, that allowed any architectural form, those cities struggle. People flee them. They're economically depressed. Turns out beauty actually is functional. Here's what you can do. Because Scruton always insisted philosophy must lead to action. First, trust your aesthetic reactions. If a building makes you feel sick, you're perceiving something real. Don't let anyone tell you it's just subjective preference or that you need more education to appreciate it. Second, defend beauty in your community. When developers propose demolishing historic buildings, object. When planning boards consider modernist designs that violate neighborhood character, speak up. You have standing. Beauty is a common good, and its destruction harms everyone. Third, build beautifully if you have opportunity. Hire architects who respect tradition. Use local materials. Respect human scale. Create buildings that will be good neighbors. Fourth, support institutions teaching traditional architecture. There are schools now training architects in classical principles, in traditional building techniques, in the wisdom modernism abandoned. And finally, raise your children to love beauty. Take them to beautiful places. Teach them why that building is beautiful and that one isn't. Give them the vocabulary and principles to perceive and defend objective beauty. Because ultimately, this isn't about architecture. It's about whether we believe human beings have souls that need beauty or whether we're just biological machines needing efficient shelter. We've traced the error that destroyed our cities. The modernist lie that form follows function, that beauty is optional, that architecture is about buildings rather than homes for human souls. You've seen how this ideology, dressed up as progressive innovation, actually produced functional failures and spiritual devastation. How it claimed to serve the people while building environments the architects themselves wouldn't inhabit. How it replaced accumulated wisdom with revolutionary theory and beauty with brutality. But you've also discovered grounds for hope. The lie is being exposed. People are demanding beauty. Architects are relearning traditional wisdom. Cities that preserve their heritage are thriving while those that embrace pure modernism are failing. Scruton would tell you, the path forward isn't mysterious. Build beautifully. Repudiation. Acknowledge that humans need environments worthy of their spiritual dignity. Stop lying to yourself that ugliness is honest or that function excludes beauty. One practical truth to live today. When you see beauty, defend it. When you see ugliness threatening to replace it, object. Your aesthetic reactions aren't subjective preferences. They're moral perceptions. Trust them. Roger Scruton spent his life teaching us to see truly, to defend beauty courageously, to build worthily. Subscribe to continue exploring how philosophy transforms the way you see, judge, and live in the world.